When a mother believes she has buried the past, she learns to live with silence. But what if, 20 years later, that past raises its hand in a luxury restaurant, wearing a ring that should have been in the coffin of her missing son? That is exactly what happened to Rosalia. An ordinary dinner, among crystal glasses and empty conversations, was interrupted by an impossible detail to ignore. A sapphire ring engraved with the letter R, turning on the finger of a simple man who did not belong in that place. In that instant, everything she believed she knew about her son's death began to collapse. Because that ring was not similar. Was the same one. The jewel she had commissioned for Roberto before his disappearance. The jewel she believed had been buried with him. And now it was there, alive, present, worn on the hand of a stranger calmly dining with an innocent child by his side. What would you do if you realized that the greatest pain of your life might have been built on a mistake? What if the son you mourned for decades had not simply vanished, but had left something far greater behind? A truth capable of turning your guilt inside out, exposing the failures of an entire system, and revealing a blood bond where no one had ever looked. This is not just a story about a lost ring. It is a story about silence, pride, forgiveness, and secrets buried too soon. Because the closer Rosalia gets to this man, the more she discovers that the ring is only the tip of something much deeper. Something that involves an unlikely love, a promise made under the rain, a child who can change everything, and a revelation no one at that table was prepared to face. Stay until the end because the path to the truth is full of twists and turns. And when everything finally comes to light, the question is no longer who was wrong in the past, but who will have the courage to choose the right future. If you enjoy intense stories filled with mystery, emotion, and twists that keep you hooked from beginning to end, subscribe to the channel now. You will not forget this story. The night drifted slowly inside the restaurant, illuminated by crystal chandeliers that dripped golden light onto immaculate tables. Cutlery clinked in a polite rhythm, low laughter respected the price of silence, and everything seemed to follow the predictable script of the elite. Mrs. Rosalia sat upright, hands resting beside her untouched plate, like someone attending out of obligation rather than pleasure. In her early 70s, she had learned to control her appearance even when her heart refused to cooperate. The wine had no flavor, the conversation held no interest, and the background music felt too distant to stir any real emotion. Nothing about that night truly mattered. Until a banal gesture sliced through the scene like an invisible blade. 3 tables away, a man raised his hand to call the waiter, a simple, automatic movement. There was no noise, no announcement, just a brief reflection under the warm light of the dining room. Rosalia felt her body react before her mind, as if something ancient had been dragged out of the shadows without permission. Her gaze locked onto that spot with an intensity that bordered on uncomfortable. Her heart slowed for a second and then raced too fast, stumbling inside her chest. The world around her lost sharpness, like an old photograph beginning to blur. She blinked, trying to convince herself she was mistaken. But the glint remained. The ring was there, too clear to ignore. White gold, deep blue sapphire, square cut, and small inlays forming a letter Rosalia knew better than her own name. The letter R. It wasn't just a beautiful piece of jewelry. It was something she had commissioned with almost obsessive care. A gift conceived over months, designed to carry identity, memory, and promise. It wasn't something common that could be easily confused. The air seemed to thin, and Rosalia brought a hand to her chest without realizing it. That ring was not supposed to exist outside one specific place. And it certainly wasn't supposed to be there. For 20 years, she had believed that piece of jewelry rested alongside the remains of her missing son. Buried with the pain that never healed, sealed beneath the earth like a forced period at the end of a sentence left unfinished. Roberto, her only child, had vanished without clear explanations, leaving behind nothing but gaps and guilt that time never managed to organize. The ring had been placed there as a silent ritual, a way of saying goodbye to something that never had a farewell. Rosalia remembered the cold of that morning, the weight of the soil, the dull sound of the final shovel. All of it came rushing back now in disordered waves. She tried to look away, to force her attention back to her own plate, the waiter, the hollow conversation. But something inside her refused to obey. That impossible detail tugged at memories like loose threads in an old fabric. Roberto's face appeared vividly in her mind, young, impatient, with the same nervous habit of spinning objects between his fingers. Rosalia felt her throat tighten. It made no sense. It couldn't make sense. The ring wasn't similar. Was that one? The certainty didn't come from reason, but from somewhere deeper, more primitive. The dining room seemed to carry on as usual, oblivious to the silent earthquake beginning inside her. People laughed, toasted, spoke of business and travel, unaware that time had split in two at Rosalia's table. Before that gesture and after it. She watched the man more closely now, trying to absorb details without being noticed. Clothes too simple for the setting, a contained posture, an attentive gaze fixed on a child seated across from him. Nothing there matched the audacity of wearing that ring. Or perhaps it matched far more than she wanted to admit. Rosalia felt a confusing mix of anger and hope taking shape. Part of her wanted to believe it was a cruel trick of chance, a painful coincidence of the kind the world loves to play. Another part, older and more stubborn, whispered that mothers recognize what is theirs even when the entire world says otherwise. The ring pulsed under the light, almost like an insistent signal. She couldn't take her eyes off it, and her body began to betray her, trembling slightly. The past she had kept locked away for decades was knocking at the door. She took a deep breath, trying to organize thoughts that collided inside her. If that ring was there, then something was wrong with the story she had told herself for 20 years. Something didn't add up. Something had been buried too early, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of guilt. Rosalia's heart understood this before she could even bring herself to form the idea. The impossible detail wasn't just the ring. It was the possibility that Roberto hadn't disappeared the way she believed. And that possibility was beginning to grow like a restless shadow between the luxurious tables. As the man lowered his hand and returned to speaking with the child, Rosalia realized that the night would never return to normal. Dinner had lost all importance, luxury had become irrelevant, and time seemed suspended in an uncomfortable weight. She still didn't know who he was or why he wore that piece of jewelry, but something inside her had already decided she wouldn't leave without answers. The past had taken a seat at the table that night, uninvited, without warning. And Rosalia felt, with a chill down her spine, that this was only the first sign of something much bigger about to be revealed. The ring hadn't left Rosalia's mind for a single second since the moment she spotted it. Even without looking directly at it, she felt the presence of that piece of jewelry as if it were etched into the air between the tables. The letter, R, seemed to grow in her memory, occupying old spaces she believed had been sealed shut. It wasn't just an initial. It was the mark of an entire story, of a son who had grown up amid expectations, demands, and a love she only learned to show when it was already too late. Roberto had always been intense, proud, and that ring had been created precisely to represent that. Strong, elegant, impossible to confuse with any other. Rosalia remembered with precision the day she had commissioned the ring. The jeweler had shown her options, simpler designs, more discreet stones, but she had refused them all. She wanted something that screamed identity, something that told the world who Roberto was, even in silence. The sapphire had been an immediate choice, as deep as her son's gaze when he felt misunderstood. The letter, R, wasn't just an initial of a name, it was a signature, it was territory. That piece had never been meant to be sold, given away, or lost. It was an intimate, almost sacred symbol. And now it was there, in a restaurant, on a stranger's finger. As she watched from a distance, Rosalia felt the past begin to stir inside her like an animal forcibly awakened. Images surfaced without order, blending the impatient teenage Roberto, rebellious against rules, with the young adult who had left home after an argument that was never repaired. She remembered the last conversation, the harsh words, the pride they both carried like armor. She remembered believing the silence was temporary, that he would return when the anger passed. But days turned into months, months into years, and absence transformed into mourning without a body. The ring now seemed to mock that carefully built certainty. Rosalia felt a knot form in her stomach, an uncomfortable sensation that something essential had been ignored in the past. Mothers learn to live with guilt the way one learns to breathe in shallow water, always on the verge of drowning. And there, faced with that impossible detail, guilt took on a concrete shape. What if she had rushed to accept a version that was far too comfortable? What if Roberto hadn't simply disappeared the way everyone said? The ring explained nothing, but it dismantled everything. She watched the man more closely now, trying to find similarities her reason could use as an anchor. The shape of his face, the way he moved, the way he leaned slightly to listen to the child. Nothing screamed immediate familiarity, and yet the discomfort persisted. It wasn't him who caused the turmoil. It was Roberto's ghost, silently walking through unresolved memories. The ring acted like a key, opening doors she had kept shut for survival. Rosalia felt the urge to cry, but she held it back. She had learned not to expose vulnerability in public. The letter, R, seemed to pulse under the dining room lights as if it wanted to be noticed. Rosalia thought of how many times she had traced that same contour with her fingers, proud, while Roberto complained that she exaggerated with symbolism. He had laughed that day, spinning the ring on his thumb, saying she dramatized everything. The memory made Rosalia's chest tighten. That specific gesture, that repeated movement, was something she knew intimately. It wasn't just any detail. It was a habit, a small trait only someone who observes with love can notice. She took a deep breath, trying to convince herself that memories also play tricks. The brain looks for patterns, creates connections where they may not exist. Rosalia knew that. But she also knew that maternal intuition doesn't usually scream without reason. Something inside her insisted that the ring wasn't just similar, was the same. And that silent certainty began to corrode the structure of everything she had accepted as truth for 2 decades. The comfort of a closed-off grief started to crumble, giving way to dangerous questions. As dinner moved on to desserts Rosalia wouldn't touch, Roberto's ghost felt more present than ever. Not as a gentle memory, but as a restless presence demanding attention. She felt that if she ignored it, she would be burying her son a second time. And this time, consciously. The ring was a call not just to look but to act. Something told her that the simple man carried more than an old piece of jewelry. He carried an answer Rosalia had avoided out of fear of what she might discover. She didn't yet know how or when, but a decision was slowly taking shape. The past wouldn't go away on its own. The sapphire ring had opened an old wound, and now it demanded she go all the way. Rosalia realized, with a restrained shiver, that night wasn't just recalling Roberto. It was preparing the ground for a confrontation that would change everything she believed about her son's disappearance. And for the first time in 20 years, doubt felt stronger than grief. Lucian sat at the table like someone occupying borrowed space, overly aware of his own body and the environment around him. The restaurant was too large, too quiet, too expensive for someone used to rushed lunches and dinners whenever possible. He kept his back straight not out of etiquette, but out of respect for the daughter seated across from him. Helena swung her small feet without touching the floor, fascinated by the shiny glasses and the golden details of the room. To her, everything looked like a storybook setting, not forbidden territory. Lucian smiled at her, trying to turn that unfamiliar place into something safe. His clothes didn't scream poverty, but they didn't pretend wealth either. A simple, well-ironed shirt, clean shoes worn down by time. He was the kind of man who took care of what he had because he learned early that nothing came easily. His movements were restrained, almost too discreet for a place where people tended to take up more space than they needed. Lucian spoke softly, leaning slightly forward to listen to Helena, as if the rest of the world could disappear when she began to talk. That table wasn't a stage for him. It was just a rare moment of normalcy. He didn't notice the sideways glances at first, nor the subtle whispers, nor the silent curiosity of those wondering how someone like that had ended up there. Lucian had learned to ignore judgment long before he understood its causes. Life had taught him that explanations rarely change how people choose to see you. So he kept his focus on Helena, carefully cutting her food, asking her to try something new, laughing when she made a face. That was what mattered. The rest was noise. Helena watched everything with attentive eyes, curious in the way only children can be. She asked about the paintings on the walls, the strange dishes, the lights that looked like stars trapped in the ceiling. Lucian answered patiently, turning every question into conversation, every answer into learning. He didn't feel smaller there because of money, but he knew he didn't belong to that world. Even so, there was no shame in his posture. Just the calm awareness of someone who knows exactly who he is and why he's there. The ring on his finger wasn't on display. It sat there as it always had, part of his body, almost forgotten. Lucian rotated the ring on his thumb automatically while listening to his daughter, an old gesture repeated without thought. To him, that ring didn't represent status or luxury. It represented a promise. It represented waiting. It was an object heavy with meaning that had never fully been his. And maybe that was why he wore it so carefully, as if afraid it could be damaged by the wrong kind of gaze. The contrast between Lucian and the environment was striking to anyone watching from the outside. While nearby tables talked about investments, travel, and complicated names, he talked about school, bedtime stories, simple dreams. There was no urgency in his words, no disguised ambition. There was presence. Lucian was the kind of man who existed fully where he was, without dividing his attention with what he couldn't control. And that, paradoxically, made him seem even more out of place in a space where everything felt like performance. Rosalia watched the scene from a distance, feeling the confusion grow. The image of that man didn't match the idea of a thief, nor of someone opportunistic. The way he looked at the girl, the careful way he leaned toward her, dismantled any immediate accusation. It wasn't the behavior of someone flaunting something stolen. It was the behavior of someone protecting. And that began to create an uncomfortable conflict inside Rosalia, torn between the pain of the past and what her eyes were seeing in the present. Lucian didn't know he was being analyzed, weighed, silently judged. He simply followed the flow of that unusual night, trying to make Helena feel special. Maybe it was the sparkle in his daughter's eyes, maybe it was the rare feeling of being there with her, but something made him slightly uneasy. As if that dinner were a pause before something larger. He turned the ring once more, took a deep breath, and smiled at Helena, unaware that this simple gesture was about to connect destinies that should never have crossed. As the waiter approached the table again, Lucian felt a brief shiver without any clear reason. It wasn't fear nor obvious anxiety. It was the strange sensation of being pulled into a story he hadn't chosen to tell. Rosalia, on the other side of the room, felt something similar. Two opposite worlds were beginning to align silently, bound by an old piece of jewelry and by questions no one there was ready to answer. And that invisible convergence signaled that the innocence of that dinner had only minutes left. Helena spoke with enthusiasm, her small hands drawing stories in the air as she described something that only made sense to her. Lucian listened with genuine attention, responding as if every word mattered because to him, it did. Her laughter came easily, light and fearless, filling the space between expensive plates and the empty conversations around them. That child didn't carry the weight of the environment, nor did she notice the curious glances that sometimes lingered on their table. To Helena, the world was reduced to her father, the different food, and the adventure of being in a new place. Her presence transformed the entire setting. Rosalia watched the girl with an attention that went beyond curiosity. There was something in the way Helena leaned toward Lucian, seeking approval in every gesture, that spoke of a genuine bond. She wasn't a child trained to please, nor used as a shield. She was a loved daughter, secure enough to be herself. Rosalia felt an unexpected tightness in her chest, a distant memory of Roberto as a little boy, when he used to sit like that at the table, asking questions without fear of being wrong. That image dismantled the rigidity with which she had been preparing to accuse. Helena's innocence created a painful contrast with the suspicions growing in Rosalia's mind. How could she accuse someone of theft while looking at a child who felt protected by his side? How could she sustain anger when the scene before her radiated care and affection? Rosalia realized that any confrontation there would not be simple or clean. There were no clear villains, only people carrying different stories. And that disarmed her more than any well-crafted defense. Her heart, treacherous, began to question her own narrative. At some point, Helena noticed Rosalia's gaze and smiled, an open smile without calculation. There was no distrust there, no fear, just childish curiosity. Rosalia looked away almost immediately, feeling caught in something too intimate. That smile struck a place she had kept closed for years. It wasn't fair to involve a child in an old reckoning. And yet, the ring was still there, a silent reminder that truth does not concern itself with convenience. Lucian noticed the exchange of glances and felt a slight discomfort, but he didn't interpret it as a threat. He was used to being observed in environments that didn't belong to him. He simply pulled Helena a little closer, in an instinctive gesture of protection. The girl rested her head on his arm, calm, as if nothing in the world could go wrong in that moment. That simple gesture said more about Lucian than any long explanation. Rosalia saw it and felt the firmness of her certainties waver. Rosalia's mind fought a silent battle. On one side, the pain of 20 years, the certainty that that ring could not be there without reason. On the other, the living evidence of a relationship built with care, day after day. Helena's presence acted as an uncomfortable mirror, reflecting choices, absences, and guilt Rosalia had avoided facing. It wasn't just about the ring. It was about what happens when life takes paths we don't control. And that made her vulnerable. Rosalia realized she couldn't act driven only by indignation. Any misstep would affect that child, and that was something she wasn't willing to do. Her initial anger began to turn into something more complex, a mix of fear and a need for truth. The past demanded answers, but the present demanded care. And Helena, without knowing it, became the element that prevented an impulsive confrontation. Her mere existence imposed pause and reflection. Helena began speaking excitedly again, showing a drawing she had made on a napkin, explaining every detail with touching seriousness. Lucian praised it, carefully saving the paper as if it were something precious. Rosalia watched the scene with teary eyes, realizing that stories are not reduced to objects or isolated guilt. People are made of small gestures repeated over time. And there, at that table, was a story that didn't align with the idea of a crime. As Rosalia tried to reorganize emotions colliding inside her, a certainty began to take shape. The truth she sought would not come from a public accusation or a scandal. It would come from observing, listening, understanding. The presence of that innocent child delayed the confrontation, but also made it inevitable. Something told Rosalia that before any harsh words were spoken, she would need to understand who that simple man really was. Because the next piece of the puzzle was about to reveal itself. Rosalia noticed the gesture before she even understood why it froze her in place. It wasn't the shine of the sapphire, nor the engraved letters she already knew by heart. It was the movement. Lucian rotated the ring with his thumb in a distracted, almost imperceptible way while listening to Helena speak. A short, repeated turn like someone thinking without realizing they're thinking. Rosalia's heart made a dry, sudden leap, the kind that steals your breath for a full second. That gesture wasn't common. It wasn't elegant. It was intimate. It was exactly what Roberto used to do when he was nervous or deeply focused. The memory hit with force without asking permission. Roberto would spin the ring when he had to make a difficult decision, when he tried to hide insecurity behind silence. Rosalia remembered scolding him for it, saying he would damage the jewelry. He would just smile and keep going as if that movement were an invisible anchor. Seeing the same gesture 20 years later on the body of a stranger felt like watching an echo of the past travel through time. Rosalia felt her hands tremble slightly on the table. It couldn't be a coincidence. She tried to rationalize. Gestures can repeat themselves among different people. Human minds like to create patterns. Rosalia repeated that to herself like a fragile mantra. But the more she watched, the more certainty grew. The rhythm of the turn, the brief pause, the way the thumb pressed lightly against the side of the sapphire. Everything was too identical. That isn't learned by watching. That is carried in the body. And Roberto's body seemed to be there, borrowed by another story. Lucian remained unaware, talking to Helena, laughing softly at something only the two of them understood. The gesture repeated once more, and Rosalia felt a sharp pang in her chest, almost painful. 20 years trying to bury habits, voices, movements, and now they resurfaced in an elegant dining room, under warm lights, as if they had never left. The past wasn't just returning. It was manifesting itself in cruel, undeniable details. The decision began to form at that exact moment, silent and heavy. Rosalia realized that watching from a distance was no longer enough. The ring gesture had crossed an invisible line. This was no longer about doubt. It was about confrontation. About facing the possibility that her story had been wrong from the very beginning. She felt fear, a deep fear, not of the man at the table, but of what discovering the truth might destroy. Even so, remaining seated would be a betrayal of her own intuition. Rosalia straightened her posture, feeling the weight of the years on her shoulders. Every step she hadn't yet taken seemed to announce itself inside her. The simple act of spinning a ring had opened an old wound, but it had also offered a concrete clue, something her reason could no longer dismiss. Roberto was no longer just a distant memory. He was present in the details, in the movements, in the everyday gestures of a stranger. And that demanded answers. She looked at Helena one more time, taking a deep breath to contain the emotion. She couldn't act abruptly. Not there. Not like that. The gesture pointed to something far too serious to be treated as a public scandal. Rosalia needed silence, proximity, control. She needed to get close enough to hear that man's voice, to confirm whether the past was truly breathing there. The confrontation would have to be calculated, almost surgical. Lucian, for his part, felt a subtle heaviness in the air, as if something had changed without explanation. He turned the ring again, now with less distraction, and frowned briefly. He didn't know why, but an old unease began to stir, similar to the one that surfaced whenever confused memories tried to rise. He pushed the feeling away, focusing on his daughter, but something inside him had been touched. As if someone had recognized a sign he himself didn't understand. Rosalia placed her hands on the table, mentally preparing to stand. The ring gesture had been the final piece needed to push her toward the unknown. There was no longer any way to pretend normalcy. The night demanded movement. And while the dining room continued its elegant choreography, two stories began to align dangerously, guided by a habit too small to ignore. The next step had already been decided, even if no one else knew it yet. Rosalia rose slowly, as if afraid that a sudden movement might shatter something invisible. The dining room remained full, lively, elegant, but for her everything had grown distant, almost muffled. Each step toward Lucian's table felt like crossing 20 years of accumulated silence. There was no haste in her walk, only restrained determination, shaped by old pain and unanswered questions. She didn't want attention. She wanted closeness. She wanted to hear that man's breathing, to feel the real weight of his presence before any words were spoken. As she moved between the tables, Rosalia felt her body react in contradictory ways. Her legs steady, her heart out of rhythm. Her mind tried to organize sentences, but none seemed adequate. How do you approach someone to speak of a past that may not exist the way you imagine? How do you face the possibility of having lived 20 years in error? The fear wasn't of the confrontation itself, but of what it might reveal. Even so, the need for truth pushed every step forward. Lucian noticed her approach from the corner of his eye, even before lifting his gaze. There was something in Rosalia's posture that demanded attention, a presence that didn't match casual curiosity. He stopped speaking mid-sentence, feeling a light tension run through his shoulders. Helena remained distracted, fiddling with a napkin, unaware of the shift in energy. Lucian rotated the ring without realizing it, an old reflex in moments of discomfort. When he finally looked up, he met Rosalia's eyes fixed on him, too intense to ignore. The silence that formed between them wasn't awkward. It was heavy. A silence loaded with unspoken intentions, as if both knew that this encounter wasn't accidental. Rosalia studied Lucian's face up close now, searching for familiar traits, something that could confirm or deny her suspicions. There were signs of fatigue, fine lines around his eyes, an expression too honest for someone used to lying. That disarmed her and, at the same time, made her even more uneasy. She felt her throat tighten, but kept her voice steady when she spoke, even as everything inside trembled. There was no immediate accusation, no aggressive tone. Just a firm presence, almost predatory in the sense of someone advancing because retreat was no longer possible. Rosalia lightly rested her hand on the back of an empty chair at the table, marking territory without realizing it. Lucian followed every gesture closely, trying to understand the reason for that unexpected approach. Something in her expression said this wasn't a trivial request. Helena looked up curiously, watching Rosalia with genuine interest. The girl's smile appeared spontaneously, disarming any hardness that might have existed in that moment. Rosalia felt the impact again, a stab of humanity cutting through the rigidity she was trying to maintain. She answered with a brief, almost imperceptible nod before turning her eyes back to Lucian. She couldn't allow herself to be distracted. Not now. That child made everything more delicate, more real, more emotionally dangerous. Lucian felt the urge to protect, an automatic impulse. Not because Rosalia seemed like a physical threat, but because her presence carried something unknown, something that stirred parts of him he preferred to keep dormant. He straightened his posture, took a deep breath and waited. He didn't interrupt. He didn't question. Intuitively, he knew that woman carried something too important to be rushed. The past, even when forgotten, recognizes when it's being called. Rosalia realized she couldn't turn back. She was there now, exposed, with 20 years of guilt and love tangled in her chest. The approach hadn't been planned in detail, but it was inevitable. She needed to hear that man's voice saying something, anything, to confirm whether her suspicions had a foundation. The confrontation was about to take shape, even if it still lacked words. And that simple table, occupied by a father and a daughter, was becoming the silent center of a much larger story. While the dining room continued on, indifferent, Rosalia felt she had crossed a point of no return. The approach wasn't merely physical. It was emotional, historical, definitive. The past was no longer watching from a distance. It was there, breathing between them, demanding to be acknowledged. And before any truth could emerge, Rosalia knew she would need to say something that would change the course of that night forever. Rosalia didn't circle the subject for long. The closeness made any polite pretense impossible. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her own voice before she even spoke, and then let the words fall with controlled firmness. She said that ring did not belong to him, that it could not belong to him. It wasn't a shout or a scene. It was a statement delivered with the conviction of someone who recognizes something that shaped her life. The silence that followed was immediate and dense, as if the air had been pulled away from the table. Lucian felt the impact before fully understanding the meaning of the sentence. His eyes dropped instinctively to his hand, to the ring he had worn for so long it felt like part of his body. His thumb froze mid-motion. For a moment he thought about responding defensively, questioning the audacity of that woman. But something in the way she spoke, something in the contained rigidity of her gaze, stopped him. It wasn't an empty accusation. It was an open wound. Helena sensed the change in the atmosphere and grew quiet, watching her father with an attentiveness unusual for her age. Her laughter disappeared, replaced by cautious curiosity. Rosalia noticed the girl's silence and felt a brief flicker of remorse in her chest, but she didn't retreat. That truth could no longer be postponed. It had to be spoken there, even if the place was inappropriate, even if the consequences were unpredictable. The ring remained the invisible center of that table. Lucian lifted his gaze slowly, meeting Rosalia's eyes for the first time without distraction. There was surprise in his expression but not guilt. He seemed more confused than threatened. He asked in a low voice what she meant by that. There was no irony, no challenge. Just an honest attempt to understand. Rosalia felt the weight of that reaction and for a second, her certainty wavered. If he had reacted with aggression, everything would have been simpler. His calm complicated everything. She explained without going into details yet, that the ring had been custom-made, that it carried a specific history, that it wasn't something one simply came across by chance. She spoke carefully, choosing her words like someone stepping on fragile ground. Each sentence seemed to pull something old out of her. Lucian listened in absolute silence, feeling discomfort grow somewhere deep inside, a place without clear memories but filled with blurred sensations. Other tables began to notice the tension, even without understanding why. Curious glances appeared, quiet whispers threatened the discretion of the room. Rosalia sensed it and lowered her voice slightly but didn't stop. She couldn't. That accusation needed to exist even if it was still incomplete. The past demanded a voice. The present demanded courage. And Lucian felt something far too big was being placed on him without warning. Helena tugged gently at her father's sleeve, asking if everything was okay. Lucian smiled at her, a short, reassuring smile, even as everything inside him began to spin. That simple gesture revealed a lot to Rosalia. He wasn't trying to escape. He wasn't trying to hide. He was simply there, trying to keep his daughter protected from something he didn't even understand. That made the accusation heavier, more human. Lucian then said something Rosalia didn't expect. He didn't immediately deny it. He didn't claim ownership with arrogance. He simply said the ring had been with him for many years, that it had never been treated as a common object, and that he had never imagined someone might claim it in that way. His voice carried a sincere strangeness, as if he himself were being confronted by a story he didn't remember living. The ring now felt like a link between two strangers equally lost. Rosalia felt the emotional ground shift beneath her. The accusation had been made, but the response hadn't followed the script she had imagined for 20 years. Nothing fit perfectly. And that was frightening. She realized that confrontation wouldn't end with that sentence. On the contrary, it had just thrown open a door to something far deeper. The truth wouldn't reveal itself in a single blow. It would demand listening, memory, and time. As the dining room tried to reclaim its artificial normalcy, Rosalia and Lucian remained trapped in that suspended moment. The direct accusation had been spoken, but no resolution had appeared. Only more questions. And in the silence that followed, both felt that the next step would not be to deny or accuse again, but to tell a story neither of them was ready to revisit. Something told them the answer was hidden far beyond that table. Lucian took a deep breath before continuing, as if he needed to organize something that had never been entirely clear even to himself. He said that the ring had not been found, bought, or taken from anyone. He stated that he had kept it for 20 years, not as a possession but as a commitment. His voice did not tremble, but it carried an old weight, the kind that settles permanently in the chest. He explained that he had never considered selling it or trading it, even in moments when money would have solved many problems. That object had always had a destiny that did not depend on personal desire. Rosalia felt the words strike her like an unexpected blow. She had expected denial, a weak justification, perhaps a poorly told story. But what she heard was something different, almost solemn. Lucian said he had been waiting. Waiting for someone to return to claim the ring. Waiting for the owner to appear. That completely dismantled the idea of theft Rosalia had instinctively constructed. No one waits 20 years for something stolen. No one carries a promise for that long without a profound reason. The anger she had rehearsed dissolved into confusion. Lucian said that the ring had been entrusted to him on a night marked by rain and chaos. He did not go into details yet, but made it clear that it had not been a planned encounter. He spoke of a request made urgently by someone who knew he might not have another chance. He said that, since then, the ring had become a silent responsibility, a constant reminder of something unfinished. Rosalia felt her hands grow cold. The way he spoke did not feel rehearsed. It carried emotional memory, even if fragmented. Helena watched her father with unusual attention, as if sensing that this story was part of something larger than herself. Lucian ran a hand through her hair automatically, trying to keep her calm while speaking about a past he had always avoided explaining. He said he had never known who the man who entrusted him with the ring truly was, only that there was a mother waiting for him. That word echoed too strongly in Rosalia's chest. Mother. The world seemed to tilt slightly at that moment. Rosalia felt her eyes fill with tears, but she held herself together. The narrative Lucian presented not only dismantled the idea of theft, it built something far more disturbing. If it were true, then Roberto had not simply disappeared. He had entrusted his most symbolic possession to a stranger, with the clear intention that it would return to the right hands. That meant awareness. It meant connection. It meant that, at some point, he had thought of her. That possibility hurt more than any confirmation of death. Lucian explained that, over the years, he had tried to discover the origin of the ring, but without success. There were no full names, no documents, no clear clues. Only the promise made to a wounded and confused man. He said that many times he had considered giving up, accepting that the commitment would never be fulfilled. But something always stopped him. Perhaps it was the weight of the request, perhaps the strange feeling of carrying a story that did not belong to him. The ring had become a constant presence, almost alive. Rosalia listened in absolute silence, feeling her emotional structure reorganize itself. That simple man, whom she had nearly accused publicly, now revealed himself as the guardian of a memory she had believed buried. There was no clear villain there. There were people trapped by events they had never chosen. The certainty that Roberto had trusted that stranger created a painful mixture of gratitude and guilt. If he had trusted him, it was because he had no one else at that moment. Lucian finished by saying that he had never imagined meeting someone who would recognize the ring. Much less in that way. He said that when he saw her approach, he felt something strange, as if that old promise were finally moving forward. Rosalia felt her heart tighten painfully. The narrative of theft had not only been dismantled. It had been replaced by something infinitely more complex, more human and more cruel. The truth was beginning to take shape, but important pieces were still missing. As silence spread again across the table, Rosalia realized that this answer resolved nothing. On the contrary, it opened a dangerous path toward a forgotten night, an unexplained accident, a son who might have tried to return. The ring, once a symbol of definitive loss, now became the key to an interrupted story. And something told her that the next step would require reliving the exact moment when everything spiraled out of control. Lucian began to speak about the night as one opens a rusted door that creaks at the slightest touch. He said it was raining without pause, a thick, heavy rain that erased outlines and turned the road into a continuous blur. He was returning from work late, exhausted, when he noticed something strange near the old bridge, the one that cut across the river like a dark scar. The headlights illuminated, for a few seconds, a fallen silhouette, almost swallowed by the rapidly rising water. Lucian could have kept driving. Many would have. But something made him stop. As he got closer, he realized it was a young man, injured, trapped between a twisted guardrail and the mud. There were impact marks, blood mixed with rain, and a lost gaze that focused on nothing. The car was a few meters back, partially destroyed as if it had lost control and kissed the void. Lucian remembered the sound of the river that night, too loud, too threatening, as if it wanted to take everything with it. The man tried to speak, but the words came out disjointed, mixed with groans and shallow breaths. Lucian said he tried to ask his name, where he was coming from, whether there was anyone else in the car. Nothing made sense. The young man seemed confused, his eyes wandering as if searching for something he could not reach. Then he passed out for the first time, heavy, frighteningly still. Panic rose in Lucian, but he acted on instinct, struggling to pull him away from the water. The rain showed no mercy, and every second seemed to push them closer to complete disaster. When the man regained consciousness for a few moments, it was there, beneath the roar of the storm, that Lucian heard the request. There was no long speech, no clear explanation. Just a weak hand gripping his with unexpected strength. The young man spoke of a mother, spoke of a ring, spoke like someone who knew he might not have another chance. Lucian felt the weight of that moment without fully understanding why. The request was made with too much urgency to be ignored. Lucian described how he carefully removed the ring from the young man's finger, almost with reverence, while the rain washed everything around them. The jewel seemed to shine even in that chaotic darkness, as if refusing to disappear. He put the ring in his pocket without knowing exactly what to do, only knowing that he needed to protect it. The young man passed out again shortly after, this time for longer. Lucian feared he would not wake up again. Rescue took time. The road was blocked, the weather worsened, and the minutes dragged on cruelly. Lucian did what he could to keep the man conscious, saying nonsensical things, begging him not to fall asleep. The name Roberto was not spoken there, but his presence was already seeping into that story like a specter. Rosalia listened to every word with her stomach churning, as if she were finally approaching the exact point where she had lost her son. Lucian said that when the sirens finally appeared, the young man was already very weak. He was rushed away without clear documents, without anyone who could identify him. Lucian was left behind, soaked, trembling, with the sound of the river still echoing in his ears and the ring heavy in his pocket. That night did not end when he went home. It continued living inside him, silent, repetitive, impossible to forget. Rosalia felt every detail as if she were there, on that bridge, in that rain. The story fit together pieces she had never imagined revisiting. Roberto's disappearance, the silence, the absence of clues, everything began to take on more defined contours. But there were still gaps too painful to face. The accident explained the disappearance, but it did not explain what came after. Where had Roberto gone? Why had he never returned? The past was moving dangerously close to its breaking point. Lucian ended that part in silence, as if respecting the weight of what he had just revealed. Rosalia felt that that stormy night was only the beginning of something even more cruel. The accident on the bridge had not ended her son's story. It had begun another one, invisible, made of mistakes, bureaucracy, and forgetting. And something told her that the next truth would be even harder to endure than that endless rain. Lucian took a deep breath before continuing, as if that detail were the hardest to put into words. He said the young man woke up one last time before the ambulance arrived, for just a few seconds, long enough to leave something forever etched in memory. The rain was still falling hard, mixing with blood and mud, and the sound of the river seemed to swallow almost everything. Even so, his voice came out clear enough not to be forgotten. It was not an order. It was a plea charged with urgency and fear. Roberto grabbed Lucian's wrist with unexpected strength for someone so badly injured. His fingers trembled, but they did not let go. He seemed to be fighting his own body to stay conscious. He spoke of his mother the way one speaks of home, as if he needed to make sure something important would survive if he could not. He said that the ring had to return to her, no matter when or how. Just had to return. Lucian felt the weight of that request cut through the chaos of the night like something final. There were no long explanations, no time for questions. Roberto did not give a last name, did not give an address, did not say anything that might make fulfilling the promise easier. He only repeated the word mother, with an almost childlike insistence, as if afraid she would be forgotten along with him. The ring was placed in Lucian's hand at that moment, sealing a silent agreement between two strangers bound by an extreme moment. The rain seemed to respect that gesture for a brief second. Lucian said he tried to calm the young man, telling him everything would be okay, even without knowing if that was true. Roberto looked at him with a mix of relief and exhaustion, as if he had finally transferred something he could no longer carry alone. His thumb touched the ring one last time in an automatic gesture before his eyes slowly closed. It was then that Lucian felt, without fully understanding, that this promise would change his life. When the paramedics arrived, Roberto was unconscious again. The ring was safe in Lucian's pocket, still warm from recent contact. He tried to explain what he had heard, what had been asked of him, but everything happened too fast. The young man was rushed away, and Lucian was left behind with the strange feeling of having been chosen for something he had never asked for. The final request echoed in his mind like an obligation impossible to ignore. Rosalia listened to every word, feeling her legs weaken. The image of her injured son calling for her in the middle of the storm was more painful than any silent absence. Knowing that Roberto had thought of her in that final moment shattered something deep inside her. It was not just sadness. It was the confirmation that he had never stopped being a son, even when silence had separated them. That certainty came too late, but it came. Lucian said that night he did not sleep. The request hammered in his head, repeating itself like a sacred commitment. He did not know that mother, did not know where to find her, but he felt that failure was not an option. The ring grew heavier with each passing hour, not because of its material value, but because of the emotional weight it carried. The promise had been made. And promises like that are not broken without consequence. Rosalia felt tears slip free, unable to stop them. The past, which she had always imagined as having ended in a cold and distant way, now revealed itself as filled with love and regret. Roberto's final request was not just about returning a piece of jewelry. It was about being remembered, about not disappearing completely. And Lucian, without knowing it, had become the last bridge between mother and son. As silence once again took over the table, Rosalia realized that this request changed everything. There was no longer any room for doubt about Roberto's intention. He wanted to return even if he could not. And that transformed the pain into something even more complex. The next chapter of that story would not be about the accident itself, but about what happened afterward, when Roberto's life fell into the hands of a system that was not prepared to see someone without a past. Lucian said that days after the accident, he tried to find out what had happened to the young man taken away by the ambulance. He called hospitals, described the incident, mentioned the bridge, the rain, the critical condition. The answers were always vague, imprecise, as if that person had never truly existed. Without documents, without a confirmed identity, the young man became just another case among so many others. The system needed names, numbers, records. And when they do not exist, people dissolve into the cold corridors of bureaucracy. In the hospital, Roberto woke up days later without recognizing his own face reflected in the glass. His memory had fragmented, leaving only loose sensations, fears without origin, and a void difficult to explain. He did not know his name, did not remember home, did not recognize anyone. For the medical records, this was not a mystery, it was a technical problem. A man without a past needed a label to move forward. That was how someone suggested a temporary name, something simple, common, easy to file. Felipe was born there, not out of choice but out of administrative necessity. Rosalia felt the impact of that revelation like a slow blow. The son she had searched for over 20 years had not only disappeared. He had been replaced. Turned into another person by a hastily filled form. The idea of Roberto waking up without knowing who he was tore something deep inside her. There was no voluntary escape, no conscious rejection. There was a man lost inside his own body, trying to exist without references. The system's error was not only technical. It was human. Lucian explained that only much later did he manage to locate that specific hospital, but when he arrived there, the name Roberto appeared nowhere. Felipe, yes. A patient without family, without visitors, without a history. Lucian described the strange feeling of recognizing that man's eyes even without hearing the name he expected. Something there was familiar, even without shared memory. He understood, in that moment, that the past never completely disappears. It hides. Felipe was treated with basic care but without depth. He was discharged when possible, given generic referrals, cold instructions. There was no one to claim him, no one to ask about him, no one to call to see if he was alive. The system functioned within its limits, but those limits did not account for broken stories. Rosalia felt guilt grow in silence. While she mourned a presumed loss, her son was breathing somewhere, forgotten by everyone. Lucian said he began visiting Felipe whenever he could. Not out of legal obligation but out of moral unease. Something kept pulling him back to that simple room, to that man trying to relearn how to live without a past. He brought clothes, food, casual conversation. He never mentioned the ring. He never mentioned the promise. Even so, he felt the bond strengthening in a strange way, as if he were caring for someone he already knew without knowing from where. Felipe accepted those visits with quiet gratitude. He did not ask too much, did not demand explanations. There was in him an almost painful humility, typical of someone who knows he depends on others to exist. Gradually he learned to walk better, to speak more firmly, to work at small tasks. Life was beginning again but without roots. Rosalia imagined her son learning everything over again, without knowing who he had been, and her chest tightened with a pain difficult to name. The system's error solidified over time. The name Felipe became official, definitive. Roberto was erased without ceremony, without warning, without a chance to defend himself. There was no clear malice, only accumulated neglect. And that neglect was enough to separate mother and son for 2 decades. Rosalia now realized that the silence had not been Roberto's choice. It had been the consequence of a world that does not know how to deal with those who lose their own identity. Lucian ended this part with his voice lower, like someone carrying part of the guilt without fully deserving it. He said that many times he wondered if he should have insisted more, searched more, spoken sooner. But he also knew he was fighting structures far too large for a simple man. Felipe's birth was not a happy rebirth. It was a forced adaptation. And Roberto's story remained alive, hidden under another name, waiting for the right moment to be recognized. Lucian said that after Felipe's final discharge, he had nowhere to go. No family appeared, no name was claimed, no past came looking for him. The system fulfilled its minimal role and moved on, leaving behind a man rebuilt only halfway. It was then that Lucian, almost without realizing it, assumed a place he had never planned to occupy. He did not present himself as a savior, nor as someone responsible. He simply kept showing up. Sometimes with food, sometimes with silence, sometimes just to make sure Felipe was still there. The years passed without announcements, without clear milestones. Lucian helped Felipe find small jobs, always simple, always discreet. Nothing that required complex documents or long explanations. Felipe worked, came home tired, learned new routines like someone learning a foreign language. He did not ask questions about the past because he did not know where to begin. Lucian did not offer answers either. Both seemed to respect an invisible agreement, sustained more by care than by words. The visits were never declared an obligation. They were constant, predictable, silent. Lucian showed up on birthdays Felipe did not know if he had, on holidays that passed without meaning. He brought cake, talked about small things, commented on the weather, work, life. Felipe listened with genuine attention, like someone learning how to be human by watching another person. Rosalia felt the weight of these imagined scenes as if she were losing each one of them again, one by one. Felipe developed a rare trust in Lucian. Not the explosive trust of someone who attaches quickly, but the calm kind of trust of someone who knows another person returns. He did not ask for much, did not demand anything. He simply waited. And Lucian came back. That simple pattern created something deep. A form of family that did not need formal names. An invisible care that sustained 2 entire decades without ever being recognized by the one who mattered most. Rosalia realized that while she lived surrounded by resources, connections, and comfort, her son survived thanks to the silent persistence of a stranger. That hurt more than the absence. It hurt because it revealed a double failure. Of the system which erased him. And of herself who believed too early in a convenient ending. Lucian's love did not come from blood, but from the daily choice not to abandon. That realization cut through Rosalia like a slow blade. Lucian explained that he never told Felipe about the ring or about the request made that night. He was afraid of awakening something he would not know how to guide. He chose to wait for life to decide. The ring stayed stored away out of sight but never forgotten. It was a constant reminder that the story was not complete. Felipe in turn felt that something was missing but did not know how to name the void. He simply lived with it. Over time, Felipe came to consider Lucian family, even without using the word. There were no titles, only presence. When he fell ill, Lucian was there. When he got a better job, Lucian was the first to know. When he doubted himself, Lucian stayed. 20 years like that, building a life parallel to the one that had been lost. Rosalia felt each year as an accumulated weight in her chest, imagining how many times she could have been there. Lucian ended this part by saying that he never regretted staying. Even when life became difficult, even when everything seemed too heavy to carry alone. The invisible care had become part of who he was. Felipe was not a favor. He was a responsibility assumed with humanity. And in that moment, Rosalia understood that her son's story had not been made only of loss, but also of an improbable love she had never known. As silence spread between them once again, Rosalia realized that one essential piece was still missing. What had happened to Felipe after so many years? How had that silent story ended? Something told her that the next step would bring the most painful revelation of all, the one she had avoided for 2 entire decades. Do you want to move on to the next topic, or would you like to adjust something here? Lucian took a few seconds before speaking, as if he needed to choose not only words but courage. He said that despite the care and the attempts at rebuilding, Felipe's body never fully recovered from the accident. There were invisible aftereffects, pains that appeared without warning, lapses of energy that forced him to stop. He did not complain. He simply carried on, with that silent resignation of someone who does not expect much from the world. It was during one of those difficult phases that the final truth began to take shape, without fanfare, without preparation. Felipe fell ill quickly, almost discreetly. Short hospitalizations, confusing tests, diagnoses that never came fully formed. The system repeated the same pattern as before, treating him as someone without a relevant history. Lucian was present at every visit, holding his hand when strength failed. It was during this period that Felipe began to say strange things, fragmented memories, names that appeared and disappeared. The name Roberto surfaced a few times, whispered as if hidden behind a locked door. Lucian said that one quiet night in the hospital, Felipe woke up different. There was clarity in his eyes, an unexpected serenity. He said he remembered. Not everything but what mattered. He remembered his mother. He remembered the conflict, the argument, the hurried departure. He remembered the desire to return, to ask for forgiveness, to fix what had been broken by pride. The accident had not erased who he was. It had only delayed the meeting with that truth. Roberto, because in that moment he became Roberto again, asked Lucian to come closer. He spoke with difficulty but with conviction. He said he held no resentment that he never had. He said he understood Rosalia's silence now, because he too had learned what it means to make mistakes while trying to do the right thing. He asked that she know this. That she know he forgave her completely. Not as a favor but as a son. Those words became etched in Lucian like something impossible to forget. Rosalia felt the impact of that revelation as if the ground had given way beneath her feet. Knowing that her son had not only thought of her, but had forgiven her, was more devastating than any accusation. She had lived for 20 years believing she carried an irreparable guilt. Now she discovered that, on the other side, there had been understanding and intact love. The tears came uncontrollably, mixed with an old pent-up cry that finally found release. Lucian said that Roberto died that week, peacefully, almost serenely. There was no excessive pain, no prolonged agony. Just the exhaustion of someone who had fought more than he could. The ring was still kept safe, waiting for the right moment. Lucian held his hand until the end, feeling that the story needed to continue even after death. The promise had not expired. It had only changed form. Rosalia felt her chest break apart and reorganize at the same time. Roberto's death hurt in a new way, different from the old grief. Now there were details, there was intention, there was conscious love. The son she had lost had not run away. He had not rejected her. He had tried to return. He had tried to ask for forgiveness. And that changed everything, even if it came too late. The pain blended with a strange sense of relief. Lucian explained that he remained silent after Roberto's death because he did not know how to look for that mother without causing more wounds. The ring remained stored away, not as a reminder of death, but as a symbol of something that needed to be concluded in the right way. He never imagined that this meeting would happen that way in a restaurant by chance. But now he understood that some stories only reveal themselves when they are ready. Rosalia realized that this revelation did not bring anything to an end. On the contrary, it opened a new layer of truth, one that demanded difficult choices. Roberto had died, but he had left something alive behind. Something that had not yet been said. And in that moment Rosalia felt that her son's story was far from over. The next step would reveal an unexpected connection, capable of completely changing the meaning of family. The silence after the revelation felt too heavy to ignore. Rosalia was still trying to breathe through her own pain when something began to fall into place in an unsettling way. She turned her gaze to Helena, now with a different kind of attention, almost frightened. The girl swung her legs distractedly, unaware of the weight of the conversation, holding a folded napkin as if it were a toy. There was something familiar about her that Rosalia had not dared to name before. A detail in the shape of her face, a specific way she furrowed her brow. Something that did not belong only to Lucian. Lucian noticed the look and understood that there was no longer any way to delay it. The truth he had carried for so long needed to come out, even if it hurt. He explained that Helena was not his biological daughter. He said it without hesitation but with care, like someone protecting a fragile flame. He told her that he had met Anna at the hospital years earlier, when Roberto was still trying to rebuild his identity. Anna was a nurse, young, tired, but strangely patient with that man without a past who always seemed to apologize for existing. Rosalia felt her heart race. The name Anna echoed like a premonition. Lucian continued, saying that the bond between Roberto and Anna was born in silence, without grand promises. A quiet love, built during hospital shifts, hushed conversations and timid hopes. When Roberto began to remember fragments of the past, Anna was the first to realize there was a larger story there. And even so she stayed. Even knowing he might leave one day. Helena was born from that unlikely love. A child conceived amid uncertainty, amid the fear that memory might fully return and change everything. Anna died in childbirth, a victim of complications no one could reverse. Roberto, already fragile, did not last long after that. Lucian said he took Helena in not out of obligation but out of promise. A promise made to two dying people who only wanted to make sure that child would be loved. Rosalia felt the world tilt once again. The girl in front of her was not just any child. She was continuation. She was blood. She was an answer. Helena carried in her eyes something that had crossed generations without asking permission. The realization struck too hard to be ignored. Roberto had not only lived after disappearing. He had left behind a daughter. A granddaughter. Alive. Present. Sitting there drawing on a napkin. Lucian explained that he had never searched for Rosalia because he did not know who she was. He only knew there was a mother somewhere, and that time might have closed wounds he had no right to reopen. He raised Helena with enough truth to teach her values, but without details that could hurt her. To her, Lucian had always been her father. And that had never been a lie. It had been a choice. Rosalia watched Helena now as silent tears streamed down her face. Every laugh from the girl sounded like an echo of her lost son. The pain of loss began to mix with something new, something unexpected. Life had found a twisted, but persistent, way to continue. Lucian's confession changed everything. It changed the past. It changed the present. And it made the future terrifyingly real. Helena looked up and asked if everything was okay, with that simple concern only children have when they sense the atmosphere grow heavy. Rosalia smiled at her, a trembling smile, filled with something she had never felt before. Recognition. Immediate love. Belonging. Blood spoke louder even without words. And in that moment Rosalia knew there was still much to be decided. The confession did not end the story. It pushed it into an even more delicate territory. Because now it was no longer just about the past and guilt. It was about a living child, about bonds already formed, about choices that could not be undone. The next step would put money, power, and affection on a collision course. And Rosalia felt that not all pain can be resolved with wealth, no matter how much she had always believed otherwise. Lucian went back in time with his voice lowered, as if respecting something that had never been meant to be exposed to the world. He said that the bond between Roberto and Anna did not begin as romance but as care. She entered the room to check vital signs, adjust 4 lines, ask simple questions. He responded with excessive politeness, always apologizing for taking up space. Gradually, those technical visits turned into longer conversations, filled with pauses, comfortable silences, and questions that went beyond the medical chart. There was no luxury there, no past, no last names. Just 2 people trying to exist in the middle of pain. Anna sensed something broken in Roberto but also something rare. He did not demand attention, did not dramatize his suffering, did not complain. He observed everything with contained curiosity, as if relearning how to be human. Roberto, in turn, saw in Anna a calm he had never known before. She did not pressure him to remember, did not ask invasive questions. She was simply there. And that constant presence began to fill a space the emptiness of amnesia could no longer dominate. The hospital, with its cold corridors and rigid schedules, became the only place where that love could exist. It was a forbidden love not because of explicit rules, but because of circumstances. A patient without a past and a tired nurse did not belong in any beautiful story. There were no plans, no clear future. There were only moments stolen between shifts, discreet smiles, hands that lingered together for seconds longer than necessary. Small transgressions that kept both of them alive. Roberto began to remember fragments of the past during that period. Not complete memories but sensations tied to guilt, urgency, the desire to return to someone. Anna noticed this before any doctor did. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the fear that recovering his memory would mean losing the little he had built. Even so, she did not pull away. She knew that love had an uncertain expiration date, but she chose to stay while it existed. Loving there meant accepting instability. Lucian explained that Anna never tried to replace Roberto's mother or occupy a space that was not hers. On the contrary, she gently encouraged him to talk about that woman who appeared in dreams and fleeting lapses. Anna understood that loving someone without a past did not mean erasing it, but helping him rediscover parts of himself when he was ready. That silent respect was what sealed the depth of the bond between them. When the pregnancy was discovered, fear mixed with joy. Anna knew Roberto's body was fragile, that the future was uncertain, that the system did not forgive deviations. Even so, there was no regret. The child was not a mistake. She was an anchor. Something that gave meaning to the daily struggle. Roberto reacted with a mixture of panic and happiness, like someone who fears losing everything and at the same time has finally found a reason to stay. The hospital began to view that bond with suspicion. Comments surfaced, glances grew heavy. There was no declared scandal, but there was silent judgment. Anna felt the weight of it but did not retreat. Roberto, even without fully understanding who he had been, knew that love was not an escape. It was construction. It was a choice. And that made it even more precious. The forbidden love grew precisely because it existed on the margins. Rosalia listened to everything feeling a pain different from any she had known before. It was not just sadness. It was the awareness that her son had lived something intense and real, far from her watch, far from her control. Roberto had loved someone she had never known, in a setting she had never imagined. And yet, that love had made him better. That realization dismantled old certainties and prepared the ground for the next revelation, the one that would make it impossible to separate past, present, and future without profound consequences. Rosalia already knew, but hearing the confirmation out loud felt like taking a slow, inevitable blow. Lucian spoke the sentence carefully, almost as if asking permission from someone else's pain. Helena was not just Roberto's daughter. She was the direct continuation of a story Rosalia had believed finished decades ago. The Oliveira bloodline had not disappeared with her son's absent body. It had survived in silence, in the form of a child now drawing distractedly at the table, unaware of the weight she carried in her own name. Rosalia felt her chest open in a way she had never experienced before. It was not just emotion. It was deep recognition, almost physical. Every gesture of Helena began to take on new meaning. The way she tilted her head when thinking, her insistent curiosity, the way she observed before speaking. All of it now seemed to scream belonging. The past, which had always felt distant and unreachable, was sitting in front of her, alive, breathing, waiting for something Rosalia did not yet know how to offer. Lucian explained that he had never hidden the truth out of malice. He simply did not know how to reveal it. Telling a child that she belonged to a powerful, distant, unknown family felt far too risky. Helena had grown up with affection, routine, and clear boundaries. Introducing money, last names, and expectations could shatter that fragile balance. Lucian had protected the girl not from the world, but from the weight of an inheritance she had never chosen. And now that silent care made even more sense. Rosalia tried to speak, but her voice failed. Everything she had built around Roberto's absence was reorganizing itself in that moment. She had not lost only a son. She had lost the chance to know her granddaughter from birth. 20 years of stories she had not lived, birthdays she had not witnessed, falls she had not been there to soften. Guilt returned with force, but this time accompanied by something new. Responsibility. Helena was not a memory. She was an active present, demanding real choices. Helena looked at Rosalia with curiosity, sensing the shift in the atmosphere without understanding why. She asked who she was. The simplicity of the question cut through Rosalia like a blade. There were no ready-made titles for that moment. There was no script capable of holding that truth. Rosalia smiled with difficulty and said only her name. It was not yet time to explain everything. Some truths require preparation so they do not wound the ones who receive them. Lucian watched in silence, aware that this was the most delicate point of the entire story. The revelation did not close anything. On the contrary, it created a minefield of possibilities. Rosalia could claim. She could impose. She could try to fix everything with power and money. Or she could listen, wait, learn. The choice would define not only Helena's future, but also the true meaning of family from that moment on. Rosalia felt an old impulse rise, the one that had always solved problems with resources, contracts, and influence. But something stopped her. Perhaps Helena's attentive gaze. Perhaps Lucian's quiet dignity. Perhaps the memory of Roberto asking only for forgiveness, not control. For the first time in a long while, Rosalia realized that money was not the immediate answer. Love demanded another language, one she was still learning to speak. The final revelation did not bring instant peace. It brought conflict. It brought fear. It brought the need for difficult choices. Helena was Rosalia's granddaughter, yes. But she was also the daughter of a story built far from her. Blood connected them, but it did not grant ownership. And in that suspended moment, Rosalia understood that the greatest challenge would not be recovering what she had lost, but learning how to draw close without destroying what already existed. The silence that followed was different from all the others that night. It was no longer heavy with mystery but with choice. Inside herself, Rosalia felt the old reflex of someone who had always solved everything quickly, with contracts and figures. Her mind began to calculate possibilities almost automatically. Better schools, renowned doctors, security, a guaranteed inheritance. She only needed to reach out her hand and everything would be settled. Or at least that was what she had always believed. But in front of Helena that logic began to fail. Lucian noticed the change in Rosalia's gaze even before she said anything. He knew that kind of decision even without ever having had access to it. People accustomed to giving orders tend to believe that offering is always an act of love. That is why, when Rosalia mentioned help, future, opportunities, he did not react with hostility, but with calm firmness. He said that Helena had never gone hungry, had never slept in fear, had never needed luxury to feel safe. And that was not negotiable. Rosalia felt the sentence like a sudden break. There was no accusation there, only a clear boundary. Lucian did not speak like someone resentful, but like a father. He explained that love is not something you compensate for later with money. It is something built in daily life, with presence, with mistakes, with patience. Helena did not need to be saved. She needed to be respected. And that simple, hard distinction dismantled years of beliefs Rosalia had carried as absolute truths. She tried to argue, not out of arrogance, but out of belated desperation. She spoke of what she could offer, of what Helena deserved, of what Roberto would have wanted. Lucian listened in silence, then replied carefully. He said that Roberto had asked for forgiveness, not revenge. That he had entrusted what he had most precious to someone ordinary precisely because he did not want his daughter to be raised as an object of dispute. Those words struck Rosalia directly, without cruelty, but with precision. Helena watched the two adults attentively, sensing that something important was being decided about her life without her understanding the details. Lucian instinctively held the girl's hand, a small gesture but full of meaning. Rosalia saw that and realized she was not facing a man who wanted to compete with her. She was facing someone who had already won, not through power but through constancy. And that was something no amount of money could buy. The conflict was not explicit, but it was real. On one side, a woman accustomed to correcting absences with resources. On the other, a man who had built everything through presence. Rosalia felt ashamed for having thought that opening vaults would be enough to resolve 20 years of distance. For the first time, she understood that her money was not a bridge. It could become a wall. If she insisted, she would lose Helena before even truly getting to know her. Lucian made it clear that he would not prevent Rosalia from drawing closer. He was not the owner of the child, nor did he want to be. But he would also not allow Helena to be torn from her life to satisfy old guilt. The word torn echoed loudly. Rosalia understood the message. Closeness required time, respect, and humility. Any attempt to buy it would be a new form of violence, even if disguised as care. Rosalia felt something break inside her, but this time it was not pure pain. It was belated learning. She realized that loving that granddaughter would require unlearning many things. It would require listening more than speaking, waiting more than acting. The conflict between money and true love would not be resolved that night. But one thing was already clear. If Rosalia wanted to be part of that story, she would have to enter as a person, not as power. And as Helena squeezed Lucian's hand, safe and confident, Rosalia understood that the next step could not be imposed. It would need to be proposed. Something different from what she had done her entire life. Something that would change not only that child's destiny, but her own definition of family as well. Rosalia took longer than usual to speak. For the first time in many years, she did not have a ready solution or a structured plan. The silence around her was not weakness, it was processing. When she finally spoke, the proposal did not come in the form of a contract or a grand promise. It came simply, almost disarmed. She suggested coexistence. Not immediate change, not a transfer of custody, not impositions. Just real presence built day after day. Lucian listened attentively without interrupting. The proposal surprised him not because of its content, but because of its tone. Rosalia did not speak like someone who buys, but like someone who asks. She said she did not want to replace anyone or erase what already existed. She wanted to learn how to be there. She wanted to get to know Helena without burdening her with expectations or last names. She wanted to share meals, conversations, silences. Something far too basic for someone accustomed to living surrounded by excess. And that made the proposal different from anything he had expected. Rosalia made it clear that she was not demanding exclusivity or automatic authority. She was not talking about inheritance or financial future. She was talking about now. About being present while there was still time. She admitted that she did not know how to be a grandmother, because she had never had the chance. She admitted that she had failed as a mother, not for lack of love, but for excess of control. Those words did not come as a public confession, but as intimate recognition. And that touched Lucian in an unexpected way. Helena listened to part of the conversation, understanding only fragments but grasping the essential. There was no fight. There was no threat. There were adults trying to understand one another. She asked if Rosalia would visit her again. The simple question dismantled any remaining formality. Rosalia answered yes if she wanted to. Not as an obligation but as a choice. Helena smiled, satisfied with the short, honest answer. Sometimes that is all a child needs to hear. Lucian reflected before responding. The proposal disturbed the balance he had spent years building. Living together, even partially, meant opening space, sharing routines, accepting differences. But it also meant offering Helena something he could not give alone. History. Origin. Continuity. He realized that denying this would repeat the same mistake the system had made with Roberto. Erasing bonds out of fear. He accepted with clear conditions. No unilateral decisions. No rushing. No turning the child into a symbol of redemption. The coexistence would have to respect Helena's rhythm and what she already knew as home. Rosalia agreed without argument. For the first time she was not negotiating terms. She was simply accepting limits. And that completely redefined the concept of family for both of them. The proposal did not resolve all the pain, but it created a possible path. A space where past and present could coexist without canceling each other out. Living together did not mean immediately sharing a roof, but sharing emotional responsibility. Sharing care. Sharing choices. Rosalia felt that by giving up control, she gained something far more valuable. The chance to do things differently while there was still time. As the dinner came to an end and the restaurant returned to its artificial normality, something real began to take shape beyond the reach of curious eyes. An improbable family formed not by purchase or possession, but by conscious decision. And Rosalia understood that this proposal did not end the story. It merely prepared the ground for the final truth that still needed to surface. Lucian hesitated before touching on that point, as if he feared that any word might shatter the fragile balance they had built. He said there was something more, something he had never had the courage to show anyone. It was not a valuable object, nor an official document. It was a letter. A simple envelope, yellowed by time, kept for years at the bottom of a box he rarely opened. The letter had been written by Roberto during the period when his memory was beginning to return, when the pieces were still disconnected, but his heart already knew exactly what needed to be said. Rosalia felt her blood run cold. The idea of a letter never sent awakened an old fear. How many times had she herself written words she never delivered? Lucian explained that Roberto had written that letter in a moment of deep lucidity, days before falling seriously ill. It was not long or dramatic. It was direct, almost serene. Roberto did not write as someone who accuses, but as someone who frees himself. The letter did not ask for explanations. It offered understanding. Lucian said that Roberto wrote that he had never run away from his mother. He had left home wounded and proud, but with a clear intention to return. The accident had interrupted that plan, not the desire. In the letter, he spoke about the urgency of that day, about the decision to cross the bridge even in the storm, because he did not want to delay the reunion any longer. He wrote that he knew Rosalia had suffered as much as he had. That the silence had not been punishment, but the consequence of two hearts too stubborn to give in first. Rosalia felt her body weaken as she heard this. Her son was not returning to demand anything. He was returning to ask for forgiveness. This revelation struck the very center of the guilt she had carried for decades. Everything she had believed about abandonment and rejection began to crumble. Roberto had never wanted to disappear. He had never wanted to punish her. He wanted to fix things. And that completely changed the meaning of her pain. The guilt that had accompanied her for so long finally began to dissolve. Lucian said that Roberto had also written about Helena, even before her birth. He spoke of the hope that his daughter would grow up surrounded by love, free from disputes, without inheriting resentments that did not belong to her. He wrote that he wished for his mother to know her granddaughter not as a form of compensation, but as a natural continuation of the love that had always existed. The letter carried no demands. It carried reconciliation in advance. Lucian had never delivered the letter because he did not know how to find Rosalia. There was no address, no clear contacts. When Roberto died, he kept the envelope as one keeps something sacred, waiting for the right moment. And now, sitting across from her, he understood that moment had finally arrived. The letter no longer needed to be read aloud. Its essence was already there, crossing that table, healing invisible wounds. Rosalia cried in silence, feeling something heavy release from her chest. For the first time in 20 years, she did not see herself as the mother who had failed irreparably. She saw herself as a woman who had made mistakes while trying to love, and who had been understood by her own son. The hidden letter did not just explain the past. It absolved Rosalia of a guilt that had never been entirely hers. And that transformed her from within. The weight of the letter was not in the paper but in what it set free. Rosalia realized that the forgiveness she had sought for so long no longer needed to be asked for. It had already been granted. And in that moment, something essential aligned. The past found peace. The present gained solidity. And the future finally stopped being built on guilt and began to be raised on conscious choice. The final step of that story was ready to be taken. Some stories do not end with immediate justice. Others do not end with perfect explanations. But there are those rare stories that end with something even more valuable. Meaning? In the end, Rosalia understood that she did not lose her son completely. Roberto did not disappear into silence, nor was he erased by time. He survived in the choices he made, in the forgiveness he left written, in the love he entrusted to strangers, and, above all, in the life that continued through Helena. The ring, which began as a symbol of pain, became a witness to a cycle that finally closed without hatred, without demands, without disputes. It no longer represented a buried past, but a bridge between generations. Rosalia did not need to buy her granddaughter's love. She needed to learn how to be present. Lucian did not lose his family. He gained allies to protect what he had built with dignity. And Helena grew up surrounded by something money could never guarantee on its own: truth, belonging, and conscious love. Nothing was erased. The past was understood. Guilt gave way to forgiveness. Silence turned into dialogue. And absence transformed into legacy. Sometimes, life does not give back what it takes, but offers something even more precious in return. This story proves that not everything that is lost is gone forever, and that some truths only appear when we are ready to receive them. Now I want to hear from you. What touched you most in this story? Do you believe love can cross time even after loss? Would you have the courage to let go of control to rebuild a family in a different way? Leave your opinion in the comments because it truly matters. If this story moved you, made you reflect, or kept you watching until now, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every story carries a meaning that goes beyond entertainment. Sometimes, it also answers questions we did not even know we needed to ask.